The words hit Eliza Hurst like a bullet she had never seen coming. She stood in the center of the kitchen she had scrubbed clean with her own bleeding hands, the same kitchen where she had baked bread through 3 brutal winters and nursed a fever alone because there had been no one else to call. And she stared at the man across the table, as if he had just confessed to being a stranger wearing the face of someone she thought she knew. "You never wanted the land," she repeated, her voice dropping so low it barely existed. "You spent 2 years telling me this land was everything. You told me it was legacy. You told me it was survival. You said your grandfather bled for every acre of it, and now you stand there and tell me you never wanted it." Homer Cooper did not flinch. He stood with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly around and around the way a man does when he is searching for the right words in a language he has never spoken out loud before. His jaw was tight. His dark eyes held something raw and terrified and utterly exposed, and it was that exposure that made Eliza's chest crack open in a way that rage alone never could have managed. "I never wanted the land," he said again, quieter this time, and his voice carried the weight of something that had been locked behind a closed door for far too long. "I only wanted you to stay on it." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Eliza had ever heard. She thought she might be sick. She thought she might scream. Instead, she pressed one hand flat against the table and looked at this man, this infuriating, impossible, unknowable man who had turned her entire existence upside down and sideways. And she tried to understand how she had arrived at this particular moment in a kitchen in Texas in the autumn of 1878. It had started, as so many catastrophic things do, with a letter. Eliza had been living in St. Louis when the advertisement found her. She was 24 years old, recently left without employment after the dry goods shop where she had worked for 3 years shuttered its windows following the owner's unexpected death, and she was sharing a cramped boarding house room with 2 other women who snored in their sleep and argued loudly about everything from the weather to the price of thread. She had no family left to speak of. Her mother had died of consumption when Eliza was 17, and her father, a man of considerable disappointments, had followed 2 years later, leaving behind nothing but debt and a pocket watch that no longer kept time. The advertisement in the Missouri Democrat had been simple and honest in the way that things which would change your life often are. It read, "Cattle rancher, widower, age 31, owner of 300 acres of good land in Caldwell County, Texas, seeks a capable woman of good character willing to take on the duties of a household and the honest responsibilities of a working partnership. No romantic promises are made, only fair work and fair dealing." There had been no romantic promises. Eliza had appreciated that specificity enormously. She had seen what romantic promises looked like in practice, and she had found them consistently unreliable. Fair work and fair dealing, on the other hand, were things she understood completely. She wrote a letter that same evening, describing herself without embellishment. She was tall for a woman, dark-haired, steady-natured, an experienced cook and household manager, possessed of a strong back and a stronger will, with no illusions about the hardships of frontier life and no desire to be anywhere close to St. Louis ever again. Homer Cooper had written back within 2 weeks. His letter had been brief, almost to the point of rudeness, which Eliza had also found refreshing. He told her the ranch was called the Copper Creek Spread, which was not a romantic name but an accurate one since there was a creek that ran copper-red through the southern pasture. He told her there were 40 head of cattle currently, 2 horses, a mule named Aristotle who was difficult in the mornings, and a dog named General who was easy at all times. He told her that he worked with a hired hand named Deke Fairweather 3 days a week, and that the nearest town was a settlement called Harlan's Crossing, 7 miles east, which had a general store, a post office, a saloon, a church of the Baptist persuasion, and a doctor who was competent in all matters except teeth. He told her the house had 3 rooms and a solid roof, and that he had installed a cook stove the previous spring that drew well. He did not tell her anything about himself except that he was 31 and a widower, and that he expected honesty above all things. Eliza had packed her single trunk, settled her debts at the boarding house, and boarded the train south. She arrived in Harlan's Crossing on a Tuesday afternoon in March of 1876, stepping off the stage that connected from the rail terminus at San Antonio, and the first thing she saw was the enormous sky. She had heard people speak of the Texas sky, but she had imagined they were being dramatic. They were not. It was a sky that made everything beneath it feel simultaneously small and significant. A blue so deep and wide it seemed to contain something beyond weather, something that pressed down on you and asked what you intended to do with your life. The second thing she saw was Homer Cooper. He was leaning against a post outside the stage depot with his arms folded and his hat pulled low, and her first impression was of a man who had organized himself very carefully against the world. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair going slightly sun-bleached at the temples, and a face that had been weathered but not unkindly. He had strong hands and a straight back and the look of someone who had made a private decision, a long time ago, to keep his own counsel about most things. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he is trying to assess without appearing to assess it. "Miss Hurst," he said, pushing off the post and extending one hand. "Mr. Cooper," she said, and shook it. His handshake was firm and brief. He picked up her trunk without asking if she needed help and loaded it into the back of the wagon without a word. She climbed up onto the seat without waiting to be assisted. He appeared to notice this, and something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression, though whether it was approval or something else she could not yet read. They drove the 7 miles to Copper Creek in near silence, which might have been awkward with a different pair of people, but between Eliza Hurst and Homer Cooper proved to be simply a fact of the afternoon. The land spread out around them in shades of gold and rust, mesquite and scrub oak dotting the rolling terrain, hawks circling high overhead in the absolute quiet of a Texas afternoon. The creek appeared in the distance like a copper-colored thread drawn through the landscape, and beyond it she could see the low shape of the ranch buildings. "That's the house," Homer said. "I see it," Eliza said. "It's not much to look at from the outside." "I'm not much concerned with the outside," she said. He looked at her again sideways with that same unreadable quality and then returned his attention to the road. The house was, as advertised, 3 rooms with a solid roof. The cook stove drew beautifully. The kitchen needed a thorough cleaning. The main room was sparse but functional, and the bedroom arrangement had been managed with a practical delicacy that Eliza noted and appreciated. Homer had moved his own things to a small room off the back of the house that had previously served as storage, which he had cleared and furnished with a cot and a washstand, leaving the main bedroom entirely for her use. Nothing about this arrangement was discussed. It was simply done, and the fact that it had been done without requiring a conversation told Eliza something important about the kind of man she had come to work alongside. The first month was a careful calibration. They established routines the way 2 careful people establish routines, through observation and small adjustments, moving around each other in the kitchen, and the yard with the focused attention of individuals who are paying close attention while appearing not to. Eliza rose before dawn and had coffee on the stove by the time Homer came in from his first check of the cattle. She learned quickly that he took his coffee black and without comment, that he read whatever newspaper he could get from town while he drank it, and that he was not a man who required conversation in the mornings. She was not a woman who required it either, and so the mornings became a comfortable shared quiet. She learned the rhythms of the ranch faster than she had expected to. She was not precious about the work. She helped with the chickens and the kitchen garden and the mending and the baking and the 1,000 small tasks that kept a working household from dissolving into chaos, and she did it all without complaint, because she had never in her life believed that complaining served any useful purpose. Homer watched her work with the same sideways attention he had given her on that first afternoon, and gradually something in him seemed to settle, though he was too self-contained to say so directly. It was Deke Fairweather who named the thing Homer would not. Deke was a wiry, sun-darkened man in his mid-40s with a kind face and an inexhaustible supply of cheerful commentary on every subject under the Texas sky. He arrived 3 days a week and treated Eliza from the first as though she had always been there, and was entirely welcome, which was a relief, since she had not known what reception to expect from a hired man who had presumably formed his own opinions about the running of Copper Creek before her arrival. "He's a different man," Deke told her one afternoon in late April, the two of them repairing a section of fence while Homer was in town collecting supplies. "Since you came, Homer, he's a different man." "He seems the same to me," Eliza said, working a staple into a post. "That's because you don't know what he was like before," Deke said. "After Clara died, Lord, miss, that was a dark 2 years. I worried about him. I won't pretend I didn't." Eliza paused her work. Clara. Homer had not mentioned his wife. He had mentioned only that he was a widower, that single bare fact offered without elaboration. She had not asked for more because she had sensed very clearly that the topic had been fenced off, not out of hostility but out of something more fragile. "How did she die?" Eliza asked carefully. "Fever," Deke said. "Came on fast and took her in 4 days. They'd only been married a year." He knocked a staple in with practiced efficiency. He blamed himself for bringing her out here. She was from Georgia, a real city girl. She struggled with it, and then she got sick and he couldn't save her, and after that he closed up like a barn door in a storm. Wouldn't let anyone near him. Hired help quit because he was impossible to work alongside. Then I came, and I'm a stubborn man by nature, so I stayed. He grinned briefly. And then he put that advertisement in the paper. "He wanted help with the household," Eliza said. "He wanted proof that someone could survive here," Deke said quietly, and then seemed to reconsider and added, "At least, that's what I think." "He never said anything like that. He's not a man who says things like that." Eliza picked up her work again and did not respond, but she turned Deke's words over in her mind for the rest of the afternoon and well into the evening, and she watched Homer at dinner with a new attention, noticing the way he held himself a careful half-distance from everything, as though he had learned that closeness was a kind of risk he could not afford. Spring turned to summer, and summer was a serious business on the Texas plains. The heat arrived in June like an occupying force and established itself with no intention of leaving. Eliza learned the full meaning of the phrase, frontier endurance, as the temperature climbed past anything she had ever experienced in Missouri, and the work continued regardless. The cattle needed constant attention to water sources. The kitchen garden needed protecting from the heat. The chickens became irritable and unproductive. The creek dropped lower than Homer liked, and he and Deke spent 3 days digging out a water channel to help redirect flow to the southern pasture. Eliza kept the house and the household and did not wilt. She discovered that Homer was a man who noticed things without saying so. He brought her a bottle of liniment from town without being asked, having apparently observed that her hands were cracking from the combination of work and dry heat. He fixed the wobbling leg of the kitchen table one evening while she was reading, without announcement or expectation of thanks. He asked her once, very carefully, whether the room she slept in was hot enough at night to be a problem, and when she said it was warm but manageable, he nodded and said nothing more. But 2 days later, he had cut a second ventilation gap near the ceiling that made a measurable difference to the air circulation. These were not romantic gestures. Eliza did not interpret them as such. They were the gestures of a man who was paying attention, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that being paid attention to by Homer Cooper was one of the more affecting experiences of her adult life. She was not a woman given to sentiment. She had grown up practical by necessity and had refined practicality into something very close to armor. She did not daydream. She did not construct elaborate emotional narratives around ambiguous evidence. When she noticed, in late June, that she had begun watching for Homer's return from the range in the evenings with a specific quality of attention that was different from simple household management, she made a stern internal note and did her level best to ignore it. She was not entirely successful. The crisis, when it came, was external in origin and arrived with the particular brutality of things that threaten what you have begun, without quite admitting it, to care about. His name was Garrett Vane, and he arrived at Copper Creek on a hot July afternoon with 2 men at his back and a letter of credit from a land company in San Antonio that he presented as though it were a religious document. He was 40 years old, well-dressed in a way that cost money rather than earning it, with a broad, handsome face that had the look of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through the simple application of pressure. Eliza was the one who answered the door. "I'm looking for the owner of this property," Vane said, with a smile that did not engage his eyes. "He's not here," Eliza said. "What is your business?" "The business of opportunity, ma'am," Vane said pleasantly. "There's a rail line coming through Caldwell County within the next 18 months, and the men I represent have a very particular interest in the land that the Copper Creek spread sits on, specifically the eastern pastures and the creek itself, which, as I'm sure you know, run directly through what will be the most valuable corridor in the county once the tracks are laid." Eliza looked at the letter of credit and at the 2 hard-faced men behind Vane and felt something cold move through her despite the July heat. "I'll tell him you called," she said, and closed the door. She told Homer that evening, laying out everything Vane had said with precise accuracy, and watched the range of things that moved through his expression. He was silent for a long time when she finished. The lamplight made the angles of his face look sharper than usual. "How much did he offer?" Homer asked. "He didn't name a figure. He said there would be a formal offer made in due course." Homer was quiet again. Then he said, "This land isn't for sale." "I told him you'd tell him that yourself," Eliza said. Homer looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not fully categorize and then said, quietly and with a strange emphasis, "Good." Garrett Vane returned the following week with a formal offer. It was, Eliza had to admit, a significant sum of money. She sat at the kitchen table while Homer read the document and watched his face for information. He read it twice, put it down, and said no. Vane's pleasant expression sharpened slightly. "Mr. Cooper, I would encourage you to consider carefully. The men I represent have considerable resources and considerable patience, but they also have considerable legal resources. Questions of land title, water rights, various claims against property, these things can become complicated." "Are you threatening me?" Homer said. "I'm presenting you with the full picture," Vane said smoothly. Homer stood up from the table, and whatever quality of physical presence he carried with him in ordinary circumstances organized itself in that moment into something considerably more serious. He was not a violent man. Eliza had understood this about him early, but he was a man who knew exactly where his lines were and was entirely unafraid to stand on them. "Get off my land," Homer said. Vane got off the land, but the threat he had named did not leave with him. 3 days later, Deke arrived at the ranch with news from town that turned Eliza's stomach. Vane's men had been talking to people in Harlan's Crossing, dropping careful suggestions about irregularities in the title documents for the Copper Creek spread. Nothing specific, nothing that could be directly answered, just the kind of quiet poison that spreads through a small community like ink in water. 2 neighboring ranch owners had apparently been visited with separate offers that were contingent on the Copper Creek land also being acquired, which meant that Vane was building pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. "He's got a lawyer in San Antonio," Deke said grimly. "A man named Whitfield. He's done this before, Homer. Moved into a county, identified the key parcels, applied legal and social pressure until people sold. I heard about what he did in Frio County 2 years ago. 2 families lost their land because they couldn't afford to fight the title challenges in court." Homer said nothing. He sat with his hands flat on the table, and his jaw working, and Eliza could see the weight of it settling on him, the particular crushing weight of a threat you can see coming and cannot stop with the things you have available to you. "How much does a lawyer cost?" Eliza asked. Deke and Homer both looked at her. "A lawyer to fight the title challenge," she clarified. "If one is filed, how much would it cost?" "More than he has on hand," Deke said, with a careful look at Homer that suggested this was a sensitive matter. "I have some savings," Eliza said. "Not much, but some." "No," Homer said immediately. "It's a practical question," Eliza said. "The answer is no," Homer said, and his voice had something in it that she had not heard before, a roughness that was close to distress. "I won't take your savings, Eliza. That's not what you're here for." She wanted to say that she was not sure any more precisely what she was there for, because the definition seemed to be shifting in ways that neither of them had anticipated, and both of them were carefully not discussing. Instead she said, "Then what do we do?" Homer looked at her for a long moment. "We hold on," he said. The summer wore on, and the pressure from Vane's men intensified with the slow inexorability of a natural disaster. There were formal documents filed with the county land office in Austin, not a full title challenge yet, but the preliminary filings that suggested one was coming. Homer made a trip to San Antonio at the end of July to consult with a lawyer there, a man named Ruiz who had a reputation for competence and for charging reasonable fees to people who could not afford unreasonable ones. He returned 2 days later looking tired and grimly determined. "Ruiz thinks our position is strong," he told Eliza, standing in the kitchen while she finished the evening meal. "The original title is clean. My grandfather filed everything correctly and my father maintained it properly. But Vane's lawyer can file challenges that would take months to resolve, and during that time there are things they can do." "What kind of things?" Eliza asked. "Water rights," Homer said. "The creek. There's a legal argument they could make about riparian rights that would potentially allow them to divert the water supply to the eastern pastures. Without that water, I'd have to reduce the herd by half. Without the herd, I can't make the ranch pay. Without the ranch paying, I can't afford Ruiz." The elegant viciousness of the plan made Eliza set down the spoon she was holding very carefully. "He thought of everything," she said. "He's done it before," Homer said. They ate dinner in silence that evening. Afterward, Homer sat on the porch in the cooling air, and Eliza brought 2 cups of coffee and sat down beside him, which was something she had not done before but which seemed, in that moment, to be entirely appropriate. The sky was purple and gold in the west and full of stars in the east, and the creek made its soft sound in the distance. "I could go to Austin," Eliza said, "to the land office. I can read legal documents as well as any man, and I write a clear hand. If there are records that support your position, I might find them faster than a lawyer billing by the hour." Homer looked at her in the fading light with an expression that seemed to be fighting itself. "Why would you do that?" he asked. "This isn't your fight." "I live here," Eliza said. "You work here," he said, correcting her with a precision that seemed to hurt him even as he said it. "I live here," she repeated quietly. "There is a difference." The silence after that was different from their usual comfortable silence. It had a charge to it, an awareness, as if something had been said that went beyond the words used to say it. Homer looked at her for a long moment and then looked back at the darkening sky. "You go to Austin alone?" he asked. "I've traveled alone before," she said. "I got here from Missouri alone." "That was on a proper stage line," he said. "The Austin road, I'll be fine," she said. Another silence. Then very quietly, "I know you will be. That's not actually what I'm worried about." She turned to look at him. He did not turn to look at her. His jaw was set, and his gaze was fixed on the middle distance with the absolute focus of a man who is having a very determined internal argument. "What are you worried about?" she asked. He finally looked at her, and the thing in his eyes was raw and unguarded in a way she had never seen from him before. "That you'll go," he said, "and find something there to go to, and not come back." The confession arrived between them like a stone thrown into still water. The rings of it spread outward in all directions. Eliza sat very still. Her heartbeat had changed in a way she found medically interesting and personally alarming. "I don't have anything to go to," she said carefully. "I left everything I had to leave behind when I came here." "You could find something," Homer said. "A city, other opportunities, He stopped. Then with a visible effort, "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" she asked. "Someone who would do the work," he said, "which you do, better than anyone I've ever seen, but I didn't expect." He stopped again. The night had settled fully around them now, and the crickets were loud in the grass and the stars were thick overhead. "I didn't expect to care whether you stayed," he said finally. "I made myself a promise after Clara died that I wouldn't do that again. That I wouldn't let anyone matter that much, because people leave or they're taken, and either way the outcome is the same." "And yet," Eliza said softly. "And yet," he agreed, and the words sat between them like an entire conversation. She did not say what she might have said, not that night, because it was too soon and too much, and they were both too careful for that. But something had shifted, openly and permanently, in the way they existed in each other's presence. And the next morning, when he saddled her horse for the trip into Harlan's Crossing, where she would catch the stage to San Antonio and then the rail to Austin, he stood holding the reins for a moment with his hand over hers on the saddle horn, just for a moment, just long enough for her to feel the warmth of it. "Come back," he said. "I will," she said. She meant it with everything she had. Austin in August was a city conducting itself with determined energy despite the heat. The state capitol was a growing place in 1876, with the new capitol building under construction, and the streets full of the commercial and political traffic of a territory making itself into something more defined. Eliza navigated it with the focused efficiency that was her primary gift, located the General Land Office on a Tuesday morning, and presented herself to the clerk with a clear explanation of what she needed. The clerk, a young man named Bridges who was perhaps 22, and seemed slightly startled to be dealing with a woman on a matter of land records, tried initially to redirect her to various offices that were not the one she needed. Eliza corrected his misdirections with polite precision 3 times, and then said, firmly enough to end the game entirely, that she was looking for the original patent records and survey documentation for a land grant in Caldwell County, and that she was aware these were public records available for inspection, and that she would like to inspect them now, please. Bridges produced the records. She spent 3 days in the land office, working through documents with the careful attention she brought to everything. And on the 3rd day, late in the afternoon when the light through the windows was going amber and thick, she found it. The original survey for Homer Cooper's grandfather's land grant, filed in 1851, included a very specific notation about the creek and its water rights. The notation was embedded in the technical language of the survey description in a way that made it easy to miss if you were not looking for it. And Eliza suspected that Vane's lawyer either had not found it or was counting on no one else finding it either. The notation established, in unambiguous terms, that the water rights to the creek were inseparable from the land grant and ran with the property title in perpetuity, a formulation that under Texas law would make any attempt to separately claim riparian rights not just difficult but legally void. She copied the relevant passage in her clearest hand, had it notarized by a notary public on Congress Avenue, and was on the stage back to San Antonio the following morning. She sent a letter ahead to Homer from San Antonio so that he would know she was coming, and she sat on the stage for the long, hot hours of the return journey with the notarized document tucked inside her coat, against her chest, and thought about the way he had said come back, and the way she had felt the full weight of what he had not quite said yet, and what she had not quite said either. She was not a woman who dressed up her feelings in impractical clothing. She knew what she felt. She had known it for some time, if she was being honest with herself in the privacy of her own interior, which she preferred to be. She was in love with Homer Cooper, with the kind of love that does not announce itself in romantic speeches, but rather in the slow discovery that another person's well-being has become as real and as important to you as your own. The question was what he intended to do about it. Homer met her at the stage depot in Harlan's Crossing. He was standing in the same place he had stood the day she arrived, against the same post, with his hat in the same position. But he was not leaning. He was standing straight, watching the stage come in, and when she stepped down he took 2 full steps toward her, which was, for Homer Cooper, the emotional equivalent of running. "You're back," he said. "I told you I would be," she said. He looked at her face and then at the document case she was carrying and then back at her face. "You found something." "I found something significant," she said, and gave him the notarized copy. He read it standing on the street in the afternoon sun, and she watched the change move through him as the meaning registered, the easing of something that had been held very rigid for a long time. He looked up from the document. "Eliza," he said. "You should send it to Ruiz immediately," she said. "Yes," he said. "I will, but Eliza," she waited. "Thank you," he said, and the simplicity of it, the absolute unadorned weight of it, was more than any elaborate declaration would have been. "You're welcome," she said, equally simply. They drove back to Copper Creek and the evening was cool enough for a change, a gift from a weather system moving in from the north, and the light was gold and gentle. At the dinner table Homer produced a bottle of wine he had apparently been saving, a good Bordeaux from the merchant in San Antonio that he had bought and tucked away for some occasion he had not defined. And they drank it with their meal, and the dinner conversation was the freest and most extended they had ever had, ranging over books they had read and places they had been, and opinions they held about the state of the country and the nature of justice, and what constitutes a good life. And Eliza found to her recurring wonderment that every time she thought she had taken the full measure of Homer Cooper, he turned out to contain more rooms than she had known were there. He was funny, quietly, with a dry precision that crept up on you. He cared about things with a depth he normally kept behind the careful self-containment. He had been deeply lonely. Ruiz received the notarized copy, and within 2 weeks, the legal picture shifted dramatically. The document Eliza had found made Vane's planned water rights challenge not just weak but untenable, and Ruiz filed a counterfiling with the Caldwell County Court that put Vane's lawyers firmly on the defensive. Garrett Vane made one more visit to Copper Creek in September, this time without his 2 men, and his manner was considerably less pleasant than it had been in July. Homer met him on the porch. "You've made this difficult," Vane said. "You started something you didn't finish your research on," Homer replied. "That's a risk in any enterprise." "The rail line is still coming," Vane said. "This county is going to be worth 10 times what it is now in 5 years. "I expect you're right," Homer said. "And you're still going to hold on to this land." "I am," Homer said. Vane studied him for a moment. "Why?" he asked, and for once the question sounded almost genuine. "A man in your position, you could take the money and go anywhere. What keeps you here?" Homer glanced over his shoulder just briefly, through the open kitchen door where Eliza was working, and then back at Vane. "Everything," he said. Vane left. The legal challenges were quietly withdrawn before the end of October. The threat of Garrett Vane passed out of their lives like a storm that veers away before it fully breaks, leaving the air charged but the ground intact. October at Copper Creek was beautiful in a way that Eliza, who had arrived in March and endured the summer, had not been prepared for. The light changed, became golden and horizontal, and painted the hills and the grass and the creek in colors that made you stop what you were doing and simply look. The work was no less constant, but the days were cooler, and the cattle grew their winter coats, and the kitchen garden was harvested and put up, and the house filled with the smell of preserved things, tomatoes and beans and wild plums from the trees along the creek. She and Homer worked alongside each other in the kitchen one long Saturday, putting up the last of the plum preserves, standing close at the stove because the work required it, and the comfortable domesticity of it was so deep and so right that Eliza had to pause twice to gather herself against the specific emotion of it. He was standing very close to her. He had been standing very close to her for the better part of an hour. "You don't have to help with this," she said. "This isn't your kind of work." "I like this kind of work," he said, which was something he would never have said in April. He stopped. "I like being here," he said finally, "in the kitchen with you." Eliza set down the ladle she was holding very carefully and turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. He had, she realized, been looking at her for some time. "Homer," she said. "I know," he said. "What do you know?" she asked. "I know what I feel," he said. "I've known for a while, I just haven't," he exhaled slowly. "I made a decision a long time ago that I was going to be very careful about people, about caring for them. After Clara, I thought the safe thing was to keep everyone at a certain distance. And then I showed up," she said. "And then you showed up," he confirmed. "And I tried very hard to keep the distance, and you just a breath that might have been almost a laugh. You just ignored it entirely, not in an intrusive way. You weren't pushing at me. You were just yourself, completely yourself, without apology or performance, and somehow that was the most." He stopped again. He was not a man comfortable with this kind of speech. She could see the effort it was costing him, and the fact that he was making it anyway was telling her everything. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I want you to know that. Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because this is where I want to be. This is my home. You are." It was her turn to stop. "You are the reason it is." The silence that followed was the warmest silence she had ever been inside. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair that had escaped from her braid back behind her ear, a gesture so gentle it should not have been possible from hands as work-roughened as his, and she turned her face slightly into his palm for just a moment, just enough to acknowledge it, and felt him exhale. He kissed her very carefully, as though she were something worth being careful with. She kissed him back with considerable less caution, because she was done being careful about this particular thing. The preserves finished entirely unattended and had to be rescued from the stove some minutes later, which Homer pointed out with the dry amusement that she had come to love. And she told him it was his fault for being distracting, and he said he would endeavor to be more distracting in the future. And she felt the whole happiness of it like warmth spreading from the center of her outward to every edge. November came, and with it, a question that needed to be settled, not for reasons of impropriety, but because they were both practical people who understood that the arrangement they had arrived at was not the arrangement they had originally agreed to, and that it needed to be made right. Homer proposed on a cold, clear evening in the second week of November, standing on the porch under a sky so full of stars it looked impossibly abundant. And he did it in the Homer Cooper manner, which was to say without theatrical performance but with a depth of sincerity that made her eyes sting. "I know I'm not easy," he said. "I know I go quiet when I should speak, and I hold on to things longer than I should, and I don't always say what I mean until I've held it in for too long. I know this life is hard and the country is hard and the work doesn't stop. I know all of that." He looked at her steadily. "But I would spend the rest of my life working at being the man you deserve if you'd let me. If you'd stay. Not because I need someone here, but because I need you here. Because I love you." She said yes before he finished the sentence, which made him briefly speechless. "You're sure?" he said. "Do not ask me that twice," she said, laughing. He laughed too, that rare full laugh that transformed his face and pulled her close, and the night was cold and enormous and perfect around them. They married in December, in the Baptist church in Harlan's Crossing, with Deke Fairweather standing as witness, and the minister's wife providing the flowers from the winter supply of dried lavender she kept for such occasions. Eliza wore a dress of blue wool that she had made herself in the 3 weeks prior, and Homer wore his good coat and a new collar, and looked at her when she came through the church door with an expression of such transparent, unguarded love that Deke later told several people it was the finest thing he had seen in years. The reception was held at the general store, cleared of its merchandise for the afternoon, and the community of Harlan's Crossing turned out with the genuine generosity of people who have strong feelings about a celebration and about having something good to celebrate. There was fiddle music and dancing and more food than could possibly be eaten, and Homer, who was not a man for public demonstrations, danced with his wife twice and held her hand the third time, and looked like a man who had arrived somewhere he had not been sure he would ever reach. Winter settled over Copper Creek like a kindness after the summer and fall that had preceded it. The cold was fierce on some nights, but the house held its warmth, and the stove drew beautifully, and there were two people in it now who had no interest in the distance they had both maintained for too long. Homer, freed from the determined containment he had imposed on himself, turned out to be a person of considerable warmth, a man who had opinions about poetry and strong feelings about the treatment of the Comanche and Apache people whose land this had been, and who spoke about these things at the evening table with a thoughtfulness that surprised and moved her. He told her about his grandfather, who had been a complicated man, a man who had built something on land that carried the history of displacement, and who had apparently known it and carried that knowledge in complicated ways. "I've thought about that a lot," Homer told her one evening. "What it means to hold this land, what we owe. My grandfather took good water from people who had lived by that creek for generations before him. That's a true thing I don't know how to undo, but I also don't want to pretend it isn't so. There's a Tonkawa man," Eliza said, "who trades at the general store in Harlan's Crossing. Mr. Bridges at the land office mentioned him, actually. He said the man knows this land better than any surveyor, that he used to guide people through this county." "I know who you mean," Homer said. "His name is Standing River. He's an old man. He helped my grandfather actually years ago, showed him where the best water was." "Then perhaps," Eliza said carefully, "that's somewhere to start, not to undo what was done because that may not be possible, but to acknowledge it." Homer looked at her with that expression that she had learned meant he was moved beyond his usual range. "You are a remarkable woman, Eliza Cooper," he said. She had learned that his compliments, when they came, carried the weight of having been earned and considered, and she loved this about them. Spring returned, and with it new life. Eliza discovered in March that she was going to have a child, a discovery she made with a complex mixture of joy and practical planning that was entirely characteristic. She told Homer over breakfast, simply and directly, and watched his face go through a series of things in rapid succession: shock, wonder, terror, joy, and back to wonder, until it settled on something that was not quite any of those words but contained all of them. He reached across the table and took her hand in both of his and held it without speaking for a long moment. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you feeling all right?" "Perfectly well," she said. "Slightly sick in the mornings, but it passes." "You should rest more," he said. "I should continue exactly as I have been," she said. "Women have been having children while working since the beginning of civilization." "Not women," he stopped. "Not you," he finished. "I appreciate the concern," she said, squeezing his hand. "I will tell you when I need to slow down. I will not push myself past what is sensible, but you must trust me to know my own body." He worked at this visibly for a moment and then nodded. "All right," he said, "but you'll tell me." "I'll tell you," she promised. He told Deke that afternoon, and Deke made a sound like a man who has just seen something very good confirmed, and said he had known it would happen, and then became immediately concerned about whether the house was warm enough and the roof solid enough, and whether they needed to build another room, which turned into a 3-hour planning conversation that Homer participated in with an enthusiasm that made Eliza, watching from the kitchen window, feel something so full and warm in her chest that she had to put her hand over it. The spring of 1877 was good. The cattle multiplied, and the range was green from winter rain, and Deke's presence at the ranch went from 3 days a week to 4, which he offered himself without being asked, because the work was increasing, and because he had apparently decided that he had a personal stake in the outcome of this particular domestic arrangement. He and Eliza developed their own friendship during these months, a friendship of mutual respect and the shared comedy of watching Homer try to manage his anxiety about the pregnancy with his usual self-containment, and the self-containment losing the argument regularly. Homer built a new room off the east side of the house in May, working on it in the evenings after the ranch work was done, working with a focused, careful energy that Eliza recognized as love in its practical form. He consulted her about every dimension. He built the window at the exact height she specified. He put up shelves she had sketched on a piece of paper. He sanded the floor smooth, and Eliza put down the rug she had been making through the winter, and the room looked, when it was finished, like a room where someone would be very glad to begin their life. The baby arrived in November of 1877, a boy, sturdy and loud from the first breath, delivered by the doctor from Harlan's Crossing who arrived in time and was competent in all matters except, as advertised, teeth. Homer stayed in the house the entire labor, which was long, refusing to be moved to the porch despite the doctor's suggestions, and was present when his son arrived in the world. He held the baby with the careful exactness of a man holding something of incomprehensible value, and looked at Eliza over the child's head with an expression that she knew she would carry for the rest of her life. "Samuel," she said. "I thought Samuel." "Samuel," he repeated, and it sounded like the best word he had ever said. They were, in the days and months that followed, a family, not in any simple or uncomplicated sense, because nothing about the life they had built was simple, but in the deep, daily, functional, loving sense that matters most. Deke became effectively an uncle to Samuel, appearing with small carved wooden toys and a degree of patient playfulness that was entirely winning. The community of Harlan's Crossing treated the birth with the warmth that small communities reserve for things that confirm their belief in continuance. Homer's relationship with Standing River, whom he had sought out in the late winter at Eliza's suggestion, had developed into something quiet and meaningful, built on the understanding that some things cannot be fixed but can be honestly acknowledged, and that honest acknowledgement is not nothing. Life moved forward the way it does when it is good, in seasons and small revelations and accumulated days that add up to something that exceeds the sum of their parts. Samuel learned to walk on the kitchen floor and immediately applied himself to escaping through every available door. He had Homer's dark eyes and Eliza's determination and Deke's particular laugh, which was biologically inexplicable but absolutely true. He followed the dog General everywhere, and the two of them made a comedy pair, the enormous old hound and the small determined boy, ranging the yard together with complete conviction. And then in the spring of 1878, almost exactly 2 years after Eliza had arrived at Copper Creek, the past came back. Not Garrett Vane. Vane was finished with Caldwell County, redirected by a combination of Ruiz's legal expertise and the simple fact that several other landowners had organized in response to his tactics and presented a unified front that made the whole enterprise more trouble than it was worth. No, what came back in the spring of 1878 was something older and more personal than a land speculator. His name was James Hurst, and he was Eliza's brother. She had told Homer, in passing, that she had a brother, and had not elaborated, and Homer, being Homer, had not pressed. But the story of James Hurst was one she had carried with the determined silence she applied to the things that had genuinely hurt her. James was 3 years older than Eliza. He had been, for most of their shared childhood, the person she loved most in the world, her companion in the particular loneliness of a household run by an unreliable father and a sick mother, her co-conspirator in surviving it. And then their father had died and the debts had come clear, and James, who was 24 at the time and had been working in a bank, had taken the only money that remained, the money from the sale of their mother's jewelry, which had been held in trust for Eliza, and had left St. Louis with it. He had sent one letter, 8 months later from Kansas City, saying he was sorry and that he intended to pay it back. He had never paid it back. She had not heard from him again. He arrived at Copper Creek on a Tuesday in April, riding a borrowed horse and looking, Eliza thought when she saw him through the kitchen window, like a man who had been chewed up by the years and spit back out. She went to the door before he knocked. He stood on the porch and she stood in the doorway, and they looked at each other for a long moment. He was thinner than she remembered, and there was something careful and ashamed in his face that was new. "Eliza," he said. "James," she said. The silence carried the weight of everything that had happened and not happened in the intervening years. "I have been looking for you," he said. "It took me some time to find you. I heard you'd gone to Texas." "What do you want?" she asked, not unkindly, but with the directness of a woman who has made peace with difficult things but has not made peace with pretending they did not happen. "To apologize," he said. "For what I did. I know it was wrong. I knew it was wrong when I did it. I was desperate and I was a coward and I took your money and disappeared, and there is not a version of that story that is anything other than what it is." Eliza said nothing. "I can't give it back," he said. "I don't have it. I lost it and then I spent years trying to recover it and I couldn't. I know that makes this worse. I know there's no apology that is equal to what I did." He looked at her with an expression of genuine remorse that she recognized as real because she had known James Hurst her whole life and she knew his face completely. "But I wanted you to know that I know what I did, and that I'm sorry, and that you were the best part of my life, and I threw that away and I've known it ever since." Behind her, she heard Homer's step in the hallway. He came to stand beside her in the doorway, not in front of her, beside her, with the easy instinct of a man who understands what standing beside someone means. He looked at James with a quiet assessment that was not hostile but was entirely clear. "This is my husband," Eliza said. "Homer Cooper." James looked at Homer and then back at Eliza, and something moved in his face that looked like relief, as if the fact of her being this firmly and clearly placed in a life of her own making was itself a form of answer. "Come in," Eliza said, stepping back from the door. She made coffee and they sat at the kitchen table, the three of them. And the conversation was the most difficult she had had in years, moving through the terrain of the past with the careful attention of people navigating rocky ground. Homer sat beside her and said very little, but she could feel him beside her the way you feel something solid when you are leaning against it, the warmth and the realness of it. She did not forgive James in an afternoon. Forgiveness is not an afternoon's work. But she told him honestly what his leaving had cost her, the specific practical and emotional costs of it, and he listened without defending himself, and that listening was itself something. She told him she did not know yet what it meant for them going forward, and that she was not going to pretend she did. He stayed in Harlan's Crossing for a week at the boarding house there. He came to the ranch twice more during that week. He played on the floor with Samuel in a way that was entirely natural and made Homer and Eliza share a look over his head. He told them he had been working on the cattle drives, that he was a capable horseman if not much else, and Homer, being Homer, asked if he was looking for work. James looked surprised. "I don't need charity," he said. "This isn't charity," Homer said. "Deke's knees are bad and I need an extra man through the summer. It's 4 days a week and it pays fair wages. If you're as capable a horseman as you say, you'd earn them." Eliza looked at her husband and felt a wave of feeling so large she had to breathe through it. James looked at her. She nodded just slightly. "All right," James said. The summer of 1878 was one of the fullest and most layered of Eliza's life. James worked the ranch with the focused efficiency of a man trying to be useful, and gradually, carefully, as men do when they are working toward the same purpose, he and Homer formed the quiet alliance of labor, which is one of the truest forms of alliance there is. Deke, who knew everything, knew this was Eliza's brother, and received the information with the equanimity he brought to everything. Eliza's relationship with James rebuilt itself in the way that broken things sometimes do when both people are willing to do the work, not back to what it had been, because that was not possible, but into something new and honest, something that knew where it had been and had decided to go somewhere better. And it was in the middle of this rebuilding summer, on a still afternoon in August, that Homer said the thing he had been holding for 2 years. He had been out to the south pasture. She had been in the house. Samuel was asleep. James was in Harlan's Crossing. Deke had gone home. The house was quiet in the particular way it got in the afternoons, just the sound of the creek and the wind. Homer came into the kitchen and stood in the doorway and looked at her with an expression she had never quite seen from him before, something worked through and arrived at. "I need to tell you something," he said. She looked up from the bread she was kneading. "What is it?" He came to the table and sat down, which was unusual for the middle of the afternoon. He was turning his hat in his hands, the old familiar gesture, but there was something different in it, something like the relief of a man who has decided he is going to say the truth no matter how it sounds. "I put that advertisement in the paper," he said, "because Deke told me I needed someone for the household, and I knew he was right and it was practical. And that was what I told myself it was, practical." He looked at the hat in his hands. "But I knew when I read your letter, I knew there was something specific about the way you wrote. You were so direct and so honest, and you said exactly what you meant and nothing else, and I thought," he stopped. "I thought I would like very much to know a person who writes like that." She had stopped kneading the bread. "I told myself I was trying to survive here," he continued. "And that was true. This place was hard and I needed help, and I didn't know if any woman could stay here and not be broken by it the way Clara was. I told myself all of that the land needed someone who could manage it, that I needed someone capable." He finally looked up at her, directly and completely open. "But that was a thing I told myself to make the need seem practical when it wasn't. I never wanted the land to have someone who could manage it." He set the hat down on the table. "I wanted you to stay on it. From the moment you stepped off that stage, I wanted you here, Eliza. That is the truth of it." The confession sat between them in the warm August kitchen in the house they had built together into something real and permanent, and Eliza felt the full weight of 2 years resolve itself in a single moment of complete clarity. She crossed to where he sat and he stood up, and she put her hands on his face and held it and made him look at her. "I know," she said. "I've known for a long time." "And," he said. "And I am here," she said. "And I am staying. And I need you to stop carrying this like it's a confession that requires a verdict, because it isn't. It's the truest thing anyone has ever said to me." He pulled her close and held her the way he held things he was afraid of losing, which was completely and carefully and with the full strength of everything he had. "I love you," he said into her hair. "I have loved you for longer than I told you." "I know," she said again, and then pulled back enough to look at him with the directness that had apparently won him over from the very first letter. "I loved you by July of the first summer. I want you to know that. In case you've been calculating and want accurate data." He laughed, that full real laugh that she had collected as one of the greatest treasures of her life. "July," he said. "The fence repair," she said. "You brought me liniment for my hands. I was completely lost." "The liniment," he said, somewhat disbelievingly, and shook his head. "You paid attention," she said. "No one had ever paid attention like that." He kissed her, standing in the kitchen, in the late afternoon light, while Samuel slept in the next room, and the creek ran copper-colored in the distance, and the ranch went on being the thing they had made it together, which was not just land but the architecture of a life built by two people who had both been alone long enough to know the difference. The autumn of 1878 was the best they had yet had at Copper Creek. The herd had grown to 60 head, and the finances of the ranch were, for the first time, genuinely stable. The rail line that Garrett Vane had promised came through and did raise land values in the county, and Homer, holding what he had held against considerable pressure, found himself in an entirely better position than he would have been in had he sold. He invested in a modest expansion of the herd and improved the pasture irrigation, work he and James completed together over several weeks with the joint efficiency of men who have found their working rhythm. James made his home in Harlan's Crossing, renting a room from a widow named Mrs. Pellegrino, who ran a clean boarding house and made excellent biscuits, and he worked the ranch on his 4 days and seemed, gradually, to locate in himself something that had been absent for a long time, which was the desire to be somewhere specific and the satisfaction of having a reason to be there. He sent his wages to a savings account and did not speak of what he was saving for, and Eliza did not ask because she could see him building something and she trusted him to build it. In December, on the 2nd anniversary of their wedding, Homer gave Eliza a gift that she received with such emotion she had to sit down. It was a bookcase. He had built it himself from good oak, fitted with smooth shelves and a small scroll detail at the top that had no practical function whatsoever and was entirely decorative, which was so unlike Homer that it was more significant than any elaborate gesture could have been. He had filled it with the books she had gradually accumulated in small numbers from the general store and the occasional trip to San Antonio, and he had also included, on the center shelf, in a leather binding she had not seen before, a collection of the letters she had written to him in the months before she had come to Texas, which he had kept, every one of them, and had taken to a bookbinder in San Antonio, and had bound into a single volume with her name on the spine. Eliza Cooper, the binding read, not Eliza Hurst, Eliza Cooper. She held the book for a long time and did not speak, and he sat beside her and did not require speech, and Samuel came toddling in from the other room and climbed into Eliza's lap and patted her face with both hands with the proprietary cheerfulness of a child who finds his mother crying and considers it his personal business to resolve the situation. "All right?" Homer asked. "So much better than all right," she said. The following spring brought a new development that they had both hoped for but had not spoken about for fear of wanting it too much. Eliza discovered, in March of 1879, that she was expecting again. The morning sickness was shorter this time and she felt strong and well, and Homer was, in his Homer way, both carefully controlled and transparently overjoyed. "Don't you start trying to limit my work again," she told him. "I won't," he said, with only a minor internal struggle visible. "Good," she said. "I'll just worry silently," he said. "That I can live with," she said. James, when he was told, picked Samuel up and swung him around and announced that Samuel would have either a brother or a sister, and that either way it was outstanding news. And Samuel, who at 1.5 had opinions about most things, appeared to agree. The second child was born in November of 1879. A girl this time, arrived with less drama than Samuel had managed, and with a specific quality of calm that was immediately apparent and entirely her own. They named her Frances, after Homer's mother, and she had Eliza's coloring and Homer's watchful quiet even in infancy, which Deke said was the funniest combination of traits he had witnessed in 40 years of knowing people. The family at Copper Creek was, by the winter of 1879, complete in the most fundamental sense. Not because it would not grow or change, but because it had its shape, its weight, its foundation. The house had expanded again, a second new room and a wider porch, and the kitchen garden was larger, and the herd was 80 head. And Homer had hired 2 permanent hands in addition to Deke and James, young men from Harlan's Crossing, named Carroll and Perez, who worked the range with the energy of people who were glad to have the work. Deke's knees had officially retired him from riding the range, and he had transitioned, without anyone making a formal announcement about it, into a role that was effectively ranch manager and chief advisor and permanent fixture, which he occupied with great satisfaction. He and James had become genuine friends, which was good for both of them. Deke's family was far away in Missouri, and James's only real family was 20 minutes down the road, and the two of them found in each other a comfortable and productive companionship. James, by the summer of 1880, had saved enough to put a deposit on a small property of his own, 8 acres on the north edge of Harlan's Crossing, with a house that needed considerable work, and a well that worked and enough land for a kitchen garden and a few chickens. He showed Homer and Eliza the deed with the same look a man has when he has accomplished something he did not know if he was capable of, and has discovered that he was. "Congratulations," Homer said, and shook his hand. "Thank you for the chance," James said. "Both of you, I know I didn't deserve the chance." "No," Homer said with his honest directness. "You didn't, but you've made something of it. That matters." James looked at his sister. "I'm still sorry," he said. "I want you to know I haven't forgotten." "I know," she said. "I haven't forgotten either, but James," she touched his arm. "I'm glad you came back, I mean that." He nodded with the economy of a man who is not going to manage speech at this particular moment, and they left it there, which was the right place to leave it. By the autumn of 1880, Copper Creek was prospering. The rail line had done what Vane had predicted, raising the value of the land and bringing commerce and population to Caldwell County in ways that had changed Harlan's Crossing from a settlement into something that could honestly be called a town. There was a new school, which Eliza had been instrumental in establishing, spending 2 months the previous year writing petitions and organizing meetings, and applying the same focused determination to civic matters that she applied to everything else. There was a women's reading group that met on Thursday evenings at the church, which Eliza had also founded, and which had grown to 11 members and was the most genuinely intellectual gathering in the county. Homer, who had watched his wife systematically improve not just their household but their entire community, was so proud of her it was sometimes difficult to contain. He told her so, directly and specifically, which was his way. He named the things she had done, and said clearly that they mattered and that she was remarkable, and she received these specific, honest declarations of admiration from her specific, honest husband, and found them more sustaining than any number of vague romantic pronouncements would have been. Samuel, at 3, had his father's stubborn quietness and his mother's absolute certainty about things, a combination that made him simultaneously the most manageable and most infuriating child Deke had ever encountered, which Deke reported to both parents with great amusement. Francis, at 1, was in the process of developing opinions about everything from the arrangement of objects on shelves to the behavior of the dog General, who was old now and moved slowly, and had been adopted as Francis's personal responsibility with a thoroughness that the old dog seemed to find entirely appropriate. One evening in November of 1880, Homer and Eliza sat on the porch after the children were asleep, wrapped in coats against the cold, with coffee and the stars and the specific quality of a life that has arrived where it was going. "For years," Eliza said. "For years," Homer confirmed. "From a newspaper advertisement," she said, not quite believing it. "You were the only person who answered it who I thought might stay," he said. "You chose me specifically," she said, turning to look at him. "There were 4 letters," he said, with the matter-of-fact quality that still charmed her after all this time. 3 of them were from women who wrote about what they hoped to receive from the arrangement. You were the only one who wrote about what you intended to contribute." She stared at him. "You never told me that." "I'm telling you now," he said. She shook her head slowly. "Homer Cooper," she said, "you are the most astonishing man." "I am a very ordinary man," he said. "You are not," she said with complete certainty. He reached over and took her hand in his, the same way he had reached across the kitchen table the morning she told him about Samuel, with both hands and everything in them. "I am the luckiest man in Caldwell County," he said, "possibly in Texas." "Definitely in Texas," she said. He smiled at that, the full real smile. "You think so?" "I know so," she said, "and I am not a woman who overstates things." "No," he said, "you never have been." They sat together in the cold November night on the porch of the house that Homer had built and Eliza had made into a home, with their children asleep inside and the dog old and comfortable on the boards beside them, and the cattle quiet in the pasture and the creek running in the distance and the stars overhead in the enormous Texas sky. And the life they had built together was around them and inside them and entirely, completely real. She leaned her head against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and the night went on in its vast and quiet way, and neither of them needed to say anything more because they were both, in their very different ways, people who understood that the truest things do not always require words, but that when they are said they should be said exactly. He had never wanted the land. He had only wanted her to stay on it, and she had stayed. Not because she had been held or trapped or managed or deceived, but because she had walked into a kitchen in Texas and found a man who paid attention and built bookcases and said exactly what he meant and held on to what he loved with both hands. And she had decided, with the full and considered certainty she brought to every decision that mattered, that she was going to stay. Spring came to Copper Creek again, as it always did, changing the colors of the hills and bringing the creek up high with snowmelt from the north, and filling the air with something that smelled like the beginning of things. Samuel discovered that year that he could run faster than the dog and spent several weeks devoted to proving it. Frances learned to say Homer's name, and for a period said it constantly, testing the word with the scientific rigor of a child who has found something interesting. James planted a vegetable garden on his 8 acres and sent over tomatoes all summer with a regularity that made Eliza laugh every time a new batch arrived. Deke, whose knees had not improved but whose spirits remained entirely undimmed, declared on his 51st birthday, celebrated at the Copper Creek kitchen table with a cake Eliza made, and more food than 5 people could reasonably consume, that these were the best years of his life, and that he intended to spend the rest of them exactly where he was, which was to say in this kitchen eating Eliza Cooper's cooking and watching Homer Cooper be happy. Both of which were satisfactions he had not expected to have and did not intend to relinquish. Homer told him he was welcome to stay as long as he liked, which was not a formal offer since Deke had never technically needed one, and Deke said he knew that, which was why he had said it. By the end of 1881, Eliza found she was expecting a third time, which arrived with less surprise and more practical preparation than the previous 2 occasions. Homer began the addition of a third room without being asked, and she said nothing about it because it was the right thing to do and they both knew it. She helped him plan the layout, standing in the yard with a stick drawing in the dirt, arguing amiably about window placement for 20 minutes until they reached an agreement that satisfied them both. The third child arrived in the early summer of 1882, another boy, whom they named William, and who from the first day seemed to have decided that maximum volume was the correct approach to all situations, which was something none of the other children had done, and which Homer handled with a patience that Eliza found both touching and slightly hilarious. Samuel, at 5, was gravely responsible about the new baby. Frances, at 2.5, was interested in William in the same managerial way she was interested in everything. General, the old dog, died peacefully in his sleep one morning in the autumn of 1882, on the boards of the porch he had claimed as his territory for years. Homer buried him under the big mesquite at the edge of the yard and said nothing much about it, but Eliza found him there later, standing beside the small mound of earth, and went and stood beside him the way he had stood beside her when things were hard, simply present, simply there. They stood there for a while together, and then Homer said, "He was a good dog." "He was a very good dog," Eliza agreed. "I had him before Clara," Homer said. "He was with me through all of it." She took his hand, he held it. "Thank you," he said quietly, not elaborating. "Always," she said. They walked back to the house together in the warm autumn afternoon, and inside William was making his opinions known, and Frances was explaining something complex and important to Samuel, who was listening with the seriousness he brought to his sister's pronouncements. And the house was full of the specific sound of a family in motion, the particular beautiful noise of a life being fully lived. Homer stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, taking it in, and Eliza watched him take it in, and thought that there was nothing she needed that was not here, in this house, in this life, in this particular man who had put an advertisement in a Missouri paper, and told no romantic lies and held the door open and let her walk in. The years continued to move forward in the way that good years do, with a quality of abundance that is never quite taken for granted by people who know what scarcity feels like. The ranch grew and the family grew and the community of Harlan's Crossing grew around them, and Homer and Eliza Cooper were woven into it, the way foundational things are woven into their context, present and load-bearing and entirely themselves. James married in 1883, a schoolteacher from the New Harlan's Crossing School named Margaret Connell, a red-haired woman of considerable humor and fierce intelligence who took one look at Eliza and recognized a kindred spirit and was right. The wedding was held at the church in Harlan's Crossing and celebrated at Copper Creek, and the party lasted until midnight, and Deke danced for the first time in years, his knees protesting and his spirits too high to care. Samuel started school that same year and proved to be, as Eliza had suspected, the kind of student who finishes his own work and then sits patiently waiting for something more challenging. The teacher, a young man recently arrived from Dallas, wrote a note home saying that Samuel was the most focused child he had ever encountered, which Homer and Eliza read together at the kitchen table and received without comment, but with the shared amusement of two people who knew exactly where that trait had come from. On a warm evening in the summer of 1884, 8 years after Eliza had stepped off the stage in Harlan's Crossing and shaken Homer Cooper's hand for the first time, they sat on the porch together after the children were in bed, which was becoming a more and more theoretical concept as Samuel and Francis got older and demonstrated increasing creativity in the matter of postponing sleep. The stars were extraordinary. They were always extraordinary from this porch, but some nights they outdid themselves. "What are you thinking?" Homer asked. He asked her this sometimes, which had taken time to begin. It was the question of a man who had decided he wanted to know and who had decided that asking was worth the cost. "I was thinking," Eliza said, "about the letter I wrote to you, the advertisement response. I was thinking about what I said in it." "I remember it exactly," he said. "You still have it," she said, knowing. "It's in the bookcase," he said. "In the binding." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. "I was so careful in that letter," she said. "I didn't want to seem to want too much. I described myself in practical terms and I made practical points, and I said nothing at all about being desperately lonely and needing something to belong to and hoping, terribly privately, that wherever I was going would feel like somewhere I was supposed to be." "You didn't need to say it," Homer said. "It was in the letter anyway." She looked at him. "Was it?" "To me it was," he said. "I read a woman who was being very careful not to want anything she hadn't been offered, and I thought I would very much like to offer her everything." The stars wheeled slowly overhead in the enormous Texas night. "You did," she said. "Not at first," he said honestly. "No," she agreed. "Not at first. But eventually." "Yes," he said. "Eventually." She leaned into him and his arm came around her, and the porch and the night and the ranch that was theirs and the children who slept inside and the life that was completely, thoroughly, exactly right were all around them. And the creek ran in the darkness making its copper sound, and the wind moved through the mesquite and the grass of the hills, and somewhere far out in the pasture one of the cattle made a sound and was quiet again. "Homer," she said. He said. "I'm glad you put that advertisement in the paper." "So am I," he said. "I'm glad you wrote back." "You left me no choice," he said. "That letter was impossible to ignore." She smiled against his shoulder. "Good," she said. "I've been very glad about that." He pressed his lips to her hair, the gesture of a man who has given up hiding what he feels because he has discovered that feeling it openly is infinitely better. "Stay," he said. It was the same word he had said when she left for Austin, 2 years into their arrangement and a few weeks before he told her he loved her, and it carried now, after all these years, all the accumulated weight of everything it had always meant and everything it had grown to contain. "Always," she said, which was what she had been saying ever since. The creek ran on in the darkness, copper-red and enduring, through the land that Homer Cooper had held and the life that Eliza Hurst had built, and the home that the two of them had made from honest work and honest love and the slow, brave practice of letting another person all the way in. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.